Last weekend, I played a full chess tournament for the first time in 5 years, and it had absolutely everything. Dubious openings, tactical fights, tricky endgames, even a genuine queen sacrifice. I'm so excited to share these games with you. I hope you enjoy the recap as much as I enjoy playing them. Yes, you'd think I'd be happy with a roughly 50% score. That would be a good result, right? Wrong. This is a tournament. It is competitive. We are here to fight and win. There were 5 rounds, and that means 5 games to show you, and in each one, as before, I'll try and make 3 instructive points to take forward into my future games, and hopefully you can learn something as well. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please drop me a comment if I miss anything, if you have any feedback, and if you enjoyed the video, please click the like and subscribe button. It would mean the world to me. Thank you. For my first game against Kildara1, I had the black pieces, and my opponent opened the game with pawn to d4. After knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, knight f3 and castles for black, I am inviting my opponent to transpose into the main line of the King's Indian defence with the move pawn to e4. Here, black has allowed white to attain a big central pawn majority and tries to control the centre from a distance with the knight and the bishop, but will strike back very quickly with, after d6, bishop e2 and e5. Here will follow a big tussle for central supremacy, mostly controlling the e4 square will be very, very important. White will usually castle and play queen to c2 to try and do this, while black will play one of knight h5, knight d7 or knight e8 and f5 to try and control the e4 square, this way. This is important because my opponent takes a different route, but one that makes logical sense when you know the plan, which is to play pawn to g3, trying to control the e4 square this way by developing the bishop to g2, and then controlling e4 square by looking upon it with the bishop. After d6, bishop g2, knight b to d7, castles, e5 anyway for black and b3, we reach a position that has been played many, many times by very strong players. In my Masters database, I have over 1,000 games after pawn to b3. A number which I immediately reduced to 100 by playing e takes d4, the 5th most popular move in the position. And after knight takes d4, I reduce it further to 12 games by playing pawn to a5. What is my point here? My point is that I want to play knight to c5 to control the e4 square and also the d3 square. But if I play knight to c5 immediately, the pawn will push to b4 and kick the knight back. a5 prevents b4 because after, for example, queen to c2, knight to c5, if now b4 it will just be taken, and if a3, for example, knight here and b4, I take and you cannot recapture because of this helpful diagram I've already drawn where the rook on a1 will hang. So after a5, my opponent does indeed play queen to c2 and I play knight c5 as planned, bishop b2, and here the position has been played 60 times. You say, Sam, that doesn't make any sense. You were telling me a minute ago we'd only reached this position 12 times. Yes, but after rook to e8, we have over 60 games by masters in this position, and this brings me to my first lesson of the game, which is that especially in d4 and c4 openings, transpositions matter. They are absolutely everywhere, and particularly when you play the white sides of these openings, you really need to have a solid theoretical knowledge based on the position type itself, rather than specific move orders, because they can transpose and intermingle everywhere. So after rook to e8, there's over 60 games in the database again, played by masters. But after rook f to e1, which is the next move in the position, in fact, this is a completely new move, and now we have a new game. So let's continue. I played bishop to d7, just developing. My opponent played a3, trying to play b4. This cannot be stopped. a5 was played to prevent b4, but this is a temporary measure. Now the bishop is on b2 as highlighted. The rook on a1 is now defended by its counterpart, so it will no longer hang in the event of b4, a takes b, a takes b. So I played pawn to c6, trying to defend the b7 pawn, which is currently defended by the knight, but will be undefended after b4 and knight goes back from the bishop. And after b4, a takes b4, a takes b4, and knight e6, we take some stock of the position. So white has lots of space with the pawn on c4 and b4, and the bishop staring down the middle of the board and good central control. So I'm just drawing a bunch of arrows to show like all the squares controlled by white's pieces. So black wants to trade some minor pieces here because I'm lacking space. So I played knight e6 to try and trade some off, and white obliges. We get rook takes a8, queen takes a8, knight takes e6, and bishop takes e6. And black has achieved something. Black has traded 2 sets of minor pieces, and now the position should be roughly equal. White still has lots of space, but the advantage is not felt so clearly because there are not so many pieces on the board. As well as that, the c4 pawn is under attack, so you have to do something. My opponent played knight e4, which, according to the computer, cold-blooded as it is an inaccurate move. It allows black to win a pawn. I saw this in the game, so after knight takes e4, bishop takes g7, knight takes f2, desperadoing the knight, bishop goes away, and knight g4. Black is up a pawn, but to be honest, even though I saw this, I wasn't at all convinced I'm not just getting checkmated on the dark squares. So I didn't want to go for this. And instead we get bishop f5, which forces a bunch of trades after knight takes f6, bishop takes f6, and queen to b3. Or, as we got in the game, bishop takes f6, bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4, bishop takes f6. And now we have a bishops of opposite colour endgame. These have tendencies to be very, very drawish. It can become quite hard for anyone to make progress, especially even 1 or even 2 pawns up, because you just cannot compete on the same colour squares as the opposing bishop. So, you know, even accounting for the fact that this is a very symmetrical, very drawish position anyway, this should be even more drawish because of the presence of the opposite coloured bishops, but okay. My opponent played e3, just solidifying, and then I guess then you can move the bishop and the rook without hanging this pawn, although it is very, very well defended at the moment. I played queen to a3, infiltrating, so I'm attacking b4, and I'm just trying to get active in squares in the enemy's camp. My opponent played b5, which is a fine move. And after cb5, my opponent can keep the balance in several ways. You can play bishop to b7, and then after something in the region of queen c5, bishop d5, and b4. Not rook takes. And after b4, you end up with some position where I have made a passed pawn, but this will be very weak. And again, it will be really, really hard to make progress because the promotion square is a light square, and I don't have a light squared bishop. So this is one way to keep the balance, and the other way after takes is to play rook b1 and just threaten to take these immediately. Black has kind of ruined his structure, so the fact that I've temporarily won a pawn doesn't really mean very much. However, my opponent did not do either of these things. My opponent played c takes b5, and this is in fact a losing blunder. So if I give you a few seconds, pause the video, have a look at the position, see if you can find the move that immediately wins for black. Okay, so if you're able to find it, congratulations. The move is queen to b4, which forks the rook on e1 and the bishop on e4. After rook c1, I just take the bishop. And now this position is completely winning for black, but you still have to be somewhat careful. My opponent played queen to c7, I played queen to e7, offering a trade of queens. My opponent doesn't want this because he's down material, so he plays queen to c4. I play rook a8, I want to play rook a1 and trade a pair of rooks. When you're up material, you want to simplify the position. So my opponent plays queen to d5, just activating the queen. Now she looks at e6, she looks at b7, and it is quite hard for me to move my own queen without dropping b7. However, this does let me trade off the pair of rooks. So after rook a1, this rook cannot move as it is pinned. So my opponent took, I took, and my opponent played b6. I played queen to d7. I'm just trying to get some activity. I look at some more squares. The light squares around my opponent's king are now quite weak because there is no light squared bishop anymore. This is unlikely to be a major factor, but it does mean that the queen has a little bit more scope. So my opponent played queen to c4, and here in my analysis I've given this an exclamation mark, and you know, if you're thinking purely in terms of computer objectivity, this move is losing. Every move is losing. White is down a bishop. But the point is here that actually a lot of natural moves just lose for black. You have to be very careful here. So, for example, if I play queen to c6, a very natural move, looking for the trade of queens. This is a losing blunder. Queen takes, pawn takes, and b7, and the pawn is promoting. I can't stop it, because you come back, and okay, like, I should control the promotion square, but you can't jump over your own pawn. So actually, queen c6 would be a losing blunder, and also bishop e5, for example. In this, sorry, just going back to this position. After bishop e5, queen c7, I have to go away and drop the b7 pawn, and this position is suddenly very complicated, because again, if I take and take, then the pawn is promoting, and black loses. So you still have to be very, very, very careful. So I played, after queen c4, I did not fall into either of these traps. I played king to f8, just in preparation for queen to c7 and bringing the king to e7. This is what we got. Again, being very, very careful. After queen c7, if I take, then this loses. The pawn will promote. So this is lesson 2 for the game, which is always look for tricks. Always look for tricks, and you know, even if you're down a bishop, look tricky. It'd be very easy, if I had a bit less time than I had remaining, for me to just say, oh yes, I'll just play queen to c6 and trade the queens, and just lose the game. So after queen c7, I played king e7. Queen c4, just trying to give some checks. The other hope for white in this position is some kind of perpetual, so it makes sense that my opponent goes back and starts looking for checks. I played d5, preventing the check on e4 and also hitting the queen. My opponent played queen c5 check, I block. He played queen c8, which blunders the b6 pawn, so I took it. And after queen h3, h5, queen h3, hitting the pawn on h7, by the way, hence the move h5, queen h4 check, bishop back to block, finally bringing my extra bishop back into the game. And now queen a4, which is a mistake, but at the end of the day, the position is totally losing anyway. And I played queen to b1 check, king g2, and then queen e5. So queen e4. The point is that this hits the queen, so you have to trade, and then it's just king and 4 pawns against king 5 and bishop. So the position will be completely lost with no hope, and it was in this position that my opponent resigned the game. Lesson 3 from this game: look to simplify when you're up material. Back here, when I played, when I looked to play rook a1 and trade the rooks off, and then at the end, after queen a4, where I saw the 2 move, queen to b1 and then queen to e4, trading the queens. This makes your life a lot easier than keeping the queens on the board, where, you know, as time runs low, you might blunder into a perpetual, or blunder the bishop back, or something like this, or even, you know, a pawn promotion, as we saw a couple of tricks earlier. Just look to simplify. This was game 1, so I am now 1-1, 1 from 1, and I will show you game 2 shortly. In round 2, I had the white pieces, and I played against Menethor 28. I opened with my usual 1c4, the English opening, and after e6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, b6, d4, we transposed to the Queen's Indian defense. My opponent played bishop to b4, pinning the knight. I played bishop to b5, also pinning the knight, and after castles, e3 and bishop to b7, we have a standard type of position in these openings where the tussle is, as in the previous game, over e4. So black is controlling it with pieces and may play d5 in the future. I may play queen to c2, maybe knight f to d3, and I will try and push e4. And this will be the central battle of the position usually. This is a very similar position to the game I played the other day against Burke's Queen. Video link in the description below for that analysis. Check it out if you haven't seen it already. The main difference between those positions is, in that one I got my bishop stuck on c1. Here I moved it out to g5 before playing e3. That means the bishop is much more active, I can trade it if I want to, and it's outside the pawn chain, and I will not have problems with this bishop sleeping on c1. So this is lesson 1 for this game, which is learn from your mistakes in the opening. As soon as I saw it going towards this structure, I made sure to get the bishop out this time, because it was a problem in the previous game. So here I played bishop to e2, and my opponent played d6, similarly to Burke's Queen, where I noticed that this bishop is suddenly, sorry about that, a little bit short of squares. I may be able to exploit this in the future, maybe not, but it is worth noting these things. So I played castles, we have knight b to d7, finishing development. I played knight d2, trying to control e4 a bit more, Another idea here is bishop to f3, trying to trade this quite strong light squared bishop. My opponent played c5, I played a3, and my opponent played bishop to a5. Now, bishop a5 surprised me. I had really, in fact, expected bishop takes c3, after which we get b takes c3, say queen c7, down the c, looking at the double pawns down the c file, queen c2, defending, rook f e8, trying to control e4, f3, and then d5, striking in the center, again controlling e4, and somewhat of an even game. Instead, bishop a5 looks like an inaccurate move, because now white should play knight d to e4, attacking both the d6 pawn and the knight on f6. And in fact, now the only way for black to not be at a severe disadvantage is to take the knight on c3. But after I take back, we kind of have the same thing, except you have not managed to double white's pawns. You haven't managed to damage the structure in any way, so this should be a slightly better variation for white. However, in the game I didn't see this, and I didn't see this immediately. I thought bishop a5 was a strange move, but I didn't see knight d to e4 was the correct way to punish it. So I played bishop f3, so an accurate move, but with the idea of trading this strong light squared bishop on b7. We have bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, h6, and bishop h4. My opponent played rook to c8, again looking at the c4 pawn. Now that the light square bishop is not on the board, it is currently defended, but it may be a target in the future, especially as I've highlighted, b3 cannot be played because the knight would hang on c3. So I played knight c to e4, trying to put some pressure on the f6 knight, and here my opponent uncorked something quite shocking. Knight takes e4. Wow! Except in the game I didn't say that, I said this. Oh god, what have I missed? So what is my opponent's point here? They're sacrificing the queen. Well, the point is that after bishop takes queen, there is knight takes d2, getting a second minor piece and forking the queen and rook. And after queen e2, there are several variations, but say knight f1, if king takes f1, there is rook f takes d8, and black has obtained two minor pieces and a rook for the queen, which should be a big advantage. If after knight takes f1, bishop e7, we have a really complicated line, so rook f to e8, takes on e6, black tries to get the knight out with the help of the bishop, and white will play b4 to break the connection. The b4 square is also surveyed by the bishop, and after c takes b4, white will take the knight, and we have b3, queen to c1, defending the pawn on c4 from the rook, rook c6, attacking the bishop, and aiming to double on the c-file, and black will have some play against the c4 pawn in compensation for his missing pawn. It's a missing pawn because black has a minor piece and a rook in exchange for the queen. That's 8 points versus 9, which is roughly equivalent to a missing pawn, but he will have some compensation against the c4 pawn. In the game, I didn't see all of this, so after bishop takes d8, knight takes d2, I instead played queen to b7, attacking the rook on c8. And then after rook f takes d8, claiming the bishop, I played rook f d1, and here my opponent has two options. They can try knight b3, trying to get the knight out, but because looking at the arrows I've drawn, this is not so clear how this is ever going to happen, just because of the placement of all the pieces. So this is not so easy, so I don't blame my opponent for what they tried here, which is to explode the board. Essentially, they played c takes d4. After which we have a long force sequence, so b4, trapping the bishop, d takes e3, f takes e3, knight takes c4. And now I played rook a to c1. This creates some threats. The d6 pawn is slightly weak, so say if my opponent does nothing, so just g6 say, then there is rook takes c4, rook takes c4, and rook takes d6. And it is not so clear how you are defending this knight. And if you move the knight, the rook on a8 hangs. So rook a to c1 creates some threats. Knight d to e5, defending the knight. I finally take the piece, and now my opponent can go b takes a5, and then there's rook takes a7, after which you claim, okay, I have two pieces and two pawns for the queen, my pieces are very active, white's structure is not very good, and this is still a game, which is a perfectly valid thing to do. However, my opponent instead played knight takes a5, and this is a losing blunder as it opens the c-file. See this arrow I've drawn. So here I can give the queen back for some further material gain. So I played queen takes c8, rook takes c8, rook takes c8 check, king h7, and rook takes d6. There'll be another forced sequence where I will give the pawn back, but this essentially is giving me 2 rooks for the queen. So I'll see knight a to c4, this forks the rook and pawn. I played rook to d4, and now knight takes a3. Could also have taken e3 as we mentioned, but knight takes a3 also valid. And now we stop and take stock. So theoretically this is a big advantage for white. I have 2 rooks against the 2 knights in exchange for 3 pawns. That's roughly a 1-point advantage. However, I am very low on time again in this position. Lesson 3. Manage the clock, Sam. I didn't do this very well. Here I have 2 minutes and knights are very tricky. You have to be very careful in this position not to get forked. We'll see a few things here where there are some tactical defenses of pawns and the knights in terms of I can't do it because I'll get forked. So we'll see here. So rook a4 was played, attacking the c7 pawn, sorry, the a7 pawn. Knight a to c4. I take on a7, you take on e3. And now I played h3 because I was a bit worried about potential knight to g4 if I try and bring the king out. So now I have knight 3 to c4. And now I have to be very careful because all kinds of natural moves run into forks here. Knights are tricky. For example, rook to b8, just trying to pick up the pawn, pick up some pressure. Knight d6. Forks to 2 rooks, I give some material back, and then suddenly it is black potentially with an advantage. It might still be level, it might still be quite drawish, but certainly I will not be pushing for a win after this. Again, it's okay, so maybe a natural move is rook to d8, trying to prevent this, right? So trying to prevent this fork. So if I rook to d8, then there's knight to c6. Also forking the 2 rooks. So I have to be very careful. I'm quite low on time, and to be honest, my entire thought process through this entire endgame was don't get forked, don't get forked. Just use your 15-second increment, just check for forks. Every move, check for forks. So I played king to f2, trying to activate the king. There's b5, king e2, knight to b6, attacking the rook, rook to c5, attacking the knight and the pawn, knight d5. And now this defends the pawn tactically. Again, you have to be very careful. If I take, then there is knight here. And this actually is even worse than just the fork previously because this picks up a whole rook. And then black is completely fine after this point and might even be winning. So I can't take the pawn. So I played rook to b7, saying, okay, I'm just going to put my rook behind the passed pawn and make sure that this can't just march down the board. We have knight to f4, and I have to defend the g-pawn because it is under attack. But again, I have to be very careful. If just king f2 carelessly, then knight d3. And the king and rook are forked. And if anything, black is winning here. So king f1, not king f2. Knight c4 was played, and this actually undefends the f7 pawn. So here I had an opportunity to play rook takes f7 check. And if knight e3, as in the game, then king g1, just staying out of trouble and staying out of forks. And after you take the g-pawn, there is rook c7, and it's lights out. The game ends. Black's king will no longer be safe and will probably get checkmated in short order. I missed this. I, again, had 1 minute on the clock, so I just snapped off the pawn that was obviously hanging, the b-pawn. My opponent played knight e3 check. I played king f2. Knight g takes e2 was played. Sorry, knight e takes g2 was played. And after king f3, I thought neither of these knights can move. And my opponent seemed to agree with his 5 minutes on the clock as he played knight e1 check, which loses the game as I simply take the f4 knight. However, he could have held the balance with g5, and the game would have continued. However, he played knight e1. And after king f4, knight e3 check, king e3, and knight takes c5, the game pretty much ended. This is an easy conversion with the rook against the 3 pawns, so I won't show this in a great amount of detail, but essentially I come through, win the pawns one at a time, until my opponent allows me to deliver checkmate. So I move to 2 out of 2 at the end of a very complicated, very exciting game. and was really looking forward to round 3. I'll cover rounds 3, 4 and 5 in part 2 of Can I Win My First Chess Tournament in 5 Years. See you there.